I've lived my entire life in a holler, out in the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, deep in the mountains of Appalachia. It's a place so remote that most folks don't even know it exists on a map. Just a handful of families in dense, unforgiving woods. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here, it's a test. My family and the others who have lived here long enough to know follow a set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition, it's survival. Those who didn't follow the rules didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. Our rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific with reasons rooted in events that we don't talk about. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time when people came to these mountains from Scotland and still believed in the old ways. Whether it's spirits or something else that's out there, or things just too old to name. Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death, and each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through until morning. The first time that I broke a rule, I learned why they exist, and I'll never forget it. Every October around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge. We lived by them. My family took them seriously and not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. No, these rules were for everyone. Break one and you would put all of us in danger. Here's how they go. 1. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. 2. If you hear a single hard knock, open the door but do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving to shut the door. 3. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer. 4. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a wide-brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. 5. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all the windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. 6. If a candle is burning in the window of the old abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors no matter what. These rules didn't exist for no reason. They were handed down because bad things had happened. People vanished, people died, and strange things occurred. That's just how it was. I remember one specific year, years back, when Halloween night fell on a full moon. The air felt different, charged. My dad had a sense for when things were going to be bad. You could just feel it in the holler, thick in the air like something breathing down your neck. Dad told us to get all the preparations done early. Salt the windows now, he instructed, standing by the door, his face tight with worry. We're not waiting for the chains. I followed his orders without question, pouring salt along each windowsill and at the front and back door thresholds. My brother was baking bread, already anticipating rule number 2, the one that we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact with whatever knocked, with whatever stood on the other side of that door. We never knew who or what it was, but we knew that if you didn't offer bread, or if you dared to look, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The bread was cooling on the counter, its smell filling the kitchen. The fire was lit, burning low, and a 12-gauge lay across Dad's lap like it always did on Halloween. Isaac, my younger brother, sat closest to the window, glancing out every now and then. We had about 3 hours before sunset. The rules were clear, everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part. The longer we sat there, the more anxious we became. Did we use enough salt this year? Isaac asked quietly. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, gripping the gun tighter. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark. A single knock, slow and deliberate. Isaac and I froze, staring at the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back and be quiet. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. It was time to follow rule number 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of bread from the counter, freshly baked and still warm. He walked to the door, resting one hand on the knob. "Remember," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't look." He opened the door just wide enough to slip the basket through the crack, his eyes focused on the floor. The warm smell of the bread wafted out, and I could hear a faint shuffling on the porch. Whoever or whatever it was out there. I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare look. Dad held out the basket, his hand shaking slightly. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound, no movement, and then footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps retreating from the porch. He waited until they had faded completely and then shut the door quietly, locking it tight. Isaac let out a breath. "Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why do we have to wait for the knock?" Dad's face was pale and his eyes were hard. "We have to wait for the knock, and if we don't answer the knock, it'll come in." We thought it was over. We had followed rule number 2 to the letter, and for a moment it seemed like things were quiet. But here, nothing stays quiet for long on Halloween. Isaac was the first to notice him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where the trees meet the clearing. He was tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. He didn't move, he didn't make a sound, but he was there watching. Isaac gasped, pointing. "It's him," he whispered, voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. He knew, we all did. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. "Not for more than a second." I glanced, just enough to confirm that he was there. A tall, dark figure almost blending into the shadows of the trees, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. I looked away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. We got away from the doors and windows of the house and sat huddled in the living room. The fire, our only light. Outside, the man in the hat stood at the tree line, unmoving as the night crept on. It wasn't until after midnight that we heard the chains. At first, it was faint, a metallic clicking that seemed distant, almost like it could have been the wind, but it grew louder and closer until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains being dragged across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face turned pale. He shot me a look, wide-eyed and terrified. "The salt," he whispered. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up slowly, trying to control the tremor in my legs. I circled the house, inspecting every window and door frame. The salt lines were intact. Nothing had disturbed them. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer, but we didn't dare open the door. We didn't dare look. We stayed inside, sitting together in the flickering light of the fire, listening to the sound of the chains until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone and the chains had stopped. But as the morning light seeped through the shutters, I glanced toward the old Anderson cabin up the hill, and there it was. A single candle still burning in the window. The rules are clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions, no excuses. Even with the sun beginning to shine and the birds beginning to chirp, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal fear. We have to wait until the candle goes out before we can go outside, before the night is truly over. And that's how it goes here. The rules aren't just there to be followed. They're there to keep you alive. And if you're smart and you don't ask questions, sometimes it's better not to know. Halloween here has always been terrifying, but last year was different. It wasn't just the usual unease or the normal anxiety that came with the setting sun. It almost felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older and his movements were slower, his hands a little less steady. We all knew it, but nobody said anything. We just followed the rules like always, hoping that would be enough. We spent the day in preparation, salting the windows, baking the bread, the usual. Isaac and I were jittery, pacing around, double-checking everything. With my dad getting older, we felt a greater pressure to take it upon ourselves to prepare. The sky had darkened faster than usual, clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the last rays of the sun. By the time that dusk fell, the fire was burning low and the house sat in darkness. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The basket of bread, fresh out of the oven, sat next to him. We all waited, our hearts pounding in the silence. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure in the hat or hear the drag of chains. And then it came. A single knock, loud and deliberate. Dad stood up, and just like every other year, "Stay put," he muttered, picking up the basket with his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Isaac and I exchanged a nervous glance as Dad approached the door. As always, I stared at the floor, focusing on the sound of crackling fire, and trying to block out the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. He opened the door a crack, just enough to push the basket through without seeing whatever waited on the other side. But this time, something went wrong. As Dad leaned forward, he knocked the basket against the door frame and lost his grip. The bread tumbled out, scattering across the porch. The sudden movement, the noise without thinking. I looked up and I looked at it, and I saw it. It wasn't a man, it wasn't anything that I could name. It stood hunched over, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was sunken like a skull with pale white skin pulled tight over it, and its eyes were wild and wide. Too wide, like it didn't have eyelids. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, a black, gaping hole that emitted a horrible, deafening wail. It was a sound that I had never heard before, like metal scraping against stone, but worse. It drilled into my skull, making my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could react, before I could even scream, the thing lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing my dad by the collar. In one terrifyingly quick motion, he yanked him off the porch, dragging him toward the woods. The sound of his body scraping against the ground, his muffled cries, and the creature's horrible wail, all blurred together into a scene of pure terror. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac yelled, bolting for the door. I followed, my legs shaking and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran out into the cold night air toward the edge of the woods where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it. The candle. A single flickering light in the window of the old Anderson cabin. My blood ran cold. We had come outside when the candle was burning. I grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him to a stop. "Wait," I whispered, voice shaking. "The cabin." As if on cue, the door of the cabin suddenly flew open with a loud crash, as if something unseen was about to come storming out. Something angry. Something that should not have been awakened. "We have to go," I shouted, dragging Isaac back toward our house. We scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it, my hands trembling so badly that I could barely turn the key. The shotgun was still on the floor by Dad's chair, but it felt useless. What good would it do against something like that? But the night was far from over. We huddled in the living room, terrified, waiting for the next rule to break. Isaac was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. I stared at the door, half expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. The chains came next. We heard them clattering on the ground, dragging closer and closer. I grabbed the bag of salt, getting ready to double-check the lines of the salt that we had placed down earlier. The chains dragged right up to the front door, the metallic clinking echoing in the silence. I could hear it just outside, scraping against the wooden steps of the porch, but I knew the salt would hold. It always did. Or so I thought. Isaac was the first to notice it. We had forgotten to resalt the front door threshold after going outside. The wind from the open door had disturbed our salt line. Just as I was about to rush toward the door to resalt it, I heard the chains and a creaking against the door. It sounded as though a heavy weight was slowly leaning against it. I knew that we didn't have time. I began to back away, motioning to Isaac to go to the bedroom. Isaac screamed as the door burst open. We ran into the back bedroom, hearts pounding, breathing coming in ragged gasps. I quickly salted in front of the door to the bedroom and checked the windows. "It's in the house," I whispered. I could feel it, a presence, something cold and evil, creeping through the house toward us. I don't know how long we waited or how long we listened to the chains pacing back and forth through our house. Eventually, we heard them go back outside. Slowly, we left the bedroom and quietly closed and locked the front door. I placed a fresh line of salt in front of the door and breathed a sigh of relief. We were safe for now. But then we heard it again. A knock. But not the single knock and not the 3 knocks. This was something new, something that didn't fit the rules. It was a rapid, frantic pounding as if whatever was out there wanted in now. My heart stopped. The rules didn't cover this. Isaac looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The pounding grew louder and more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. Whatever was out there was angry, angrier than anything that I had ever felt before. "We just wait," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "We wait until daylight." The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every minute felt like an hour, every sound made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't sleep, we didn't dare move from the living room. We huddled together in front of the fire, clutching the shotgun like it was our last hope, and quietly crying over the loss of our father. The pounding on the door never stopped. The chains outside the house dragged back and forth, a constant reminder of the horror that waited just beyond the walls. And through it all, the candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, flickering in the distance like a beacon of death. But somehow we made it. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, these sounds had stopped. The pounding had ceased. The chains fell silent. The candle in the cabin had flickered out. We had survived another year, barely. But Dad never came back. Halloween in our holler has always been a test, but last year it wasn't enough. Breaking the rules cost my dad his life and everything's different. And I can't shake the feeling that this Halloween will be worse. I still remember that Halloween night like it was yesterday, even though it was the fall of 1998. I was 13, still young enough to trick or treat, but old enough to know that it would probably be my last year. You know that awkward age where you're not a kid anymore, but not quite ready to let go of the things that you love. Yeah, I was right there. My best friends, Josh and Ethan, and I had made plans weeks in advance. It wasn't just about the candy. Halloween in our town was a big deal. Streets would be packed with children and parents partied while kids ruled the night, running through lawns with half-assed costumes causing mischief. The houses were decorated to the max, with fake spiderwebs stretching across porches, jack-o'-lanterns flickering orange on every step, and skeletons hanging from trees. And the air, it had that crisp bite, just cold enough to see your breath when you exhaled, but not so cold that you needed more than a sweatshirt. You could smell the damp earth, the fallen leaves, the chocolate, and a little something else, that scent of plastic from store-bought costumes. Man, it was perfect. The 3 of us had met up at Josh's house as soon as dusk had started to creep in. His parents were hosting one of those Halloween parties for grown-ups, the kind where they hand out apple cider to the kids and spiked cider for themselves. We had on our last-minute costumes and nothing fancy. Ethan had thrown on a scream mask, Josh was a zombie, and I was wearing a cheap Batman cape with a black hoodie. We hit the houses on our street first, just to get things going. The wind rustled the orange and yellow leaves at our feet as we walked, and you could hear them tumble along the pavement. The sun had just about disappeared, leaving behind this deep purple hue in the sky, the last light of day slowly fading away. Porch lights flickered on, and soon we were moving through the first wave of trick-or-treaters. Those little kids with their parents holding pillowcases already stuffed with candy. The sounds of giggling, the wind blowing through the trees, the occasional shriek from someone who got spooked by a fake ghoul on somebody's lawn. It felt like Halloween in its purest form. After a few blocks, we made our way to Franklin Street. Now Franklin wasn't like the other streets. It had the biggest houses, old Victorians that had been there for over a century. They always went all out for Halloween, each house trying to one-up the other with elaborate decorations and bowls filled with full-sized candy bars. All of the houses on Franklin Street looked like they came straight out of a Halloween movie. All except for one, the Mallow House. Everyone in town knew about the Mallow place. It was creepy all year round, not just Halloween. The house had been built sometime in the 1800s, 3 stories tall with an overgrown yard that looked like it hadn't been mowed since before I was born. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Mallow, were an older couple who never came outside. I think I saw Mr. Mallow once or twice picking up the mail, but he was always gone before I could say hello. As we got closer to Franklin, Josh nudged me. "I'll give you a handful of candy if you knock on the door at the Mallow place this year." I laughed it off. Psych. And then what? Get murdered? But deep down, I was feeling that familiar pull. The dare, the challenge. It wasn't Halloween without doing something a little stupid, right? We made our way down Franklin Street along with all the other trick-or-treaters. There was a constant buzz of chatter and laughter as we joined the crowd moving slowly down the sidewalk. The Mallow house loomed ahead of us as we made our way closer to it, sitting completely dark. The gate at the front of the yard was open and the path leading up to the front porch covered in a layer of wet leaves. As usual, there were no decorations. No fake cobwebs, no plastic tombstones or pumpkins. But it didn't need scary decorations. The house was scary enough on its own. I didn't even have to say it aloud. We all knew it was next. Josh and Ethan started slowing down as we got closer, and I could feel the shift in the air. The excited banter between us had faded to an awkward silence. It was that kind of house that nobody really talked about, but everybody knew to just stay away. You always walked by a little bit quicker. Maybe glanced at it at the corner of your eye, but you never lingered. It wasn't because it was haunted, there were no ghost stories with it. It was just creepy. People whispered about the Mallows, mostly rumors. Mr. Mallow was some kind of veteran, though nobody was sure. And Mrs. Mallow was even more of a mystery. Some said that she had dementia and was shut up in one of the upstairs rooms. Others swore that she was dead. Either way, nobody had seen her in years. "I'm not going up there, you freaking weirdos," Ethan said. He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in his voice. Josh kicked at the sidewalk, trying to act like he wasn't bothered. I glanced up at the house. A hulking Victorian with peeling paint, a sagging roof, and windows that seemed too narrow, like they were squinting down at you. Every year, that house stood there, untouched by Halloween spirit. No pumpkins, no lights, nothing. And Josh, of course, wasn't going to let it go. He had this thing about proving himself, especially if Ethan and I were around. That year, we had spent most of our afternoons watching Faces of Death tapes in his basement, trying to outdo each other to see who was the most squeamish. He would never admit it, but this wasn't about candy. It was about who would back down first. He nudged me, a grin plastered on his face. "I'll go if you go." My stomach nodded, but I wasn't about to back down, not in front of them. "Fine," I muttered, "but we're in and out, we knock, get the candy and leave." Ethan looked between us, clearly not thrilled, but he wasn't about to be the only one to chicken out. Let's make it quick. I don't want to hang around this place." We crossed the street and made our way toward the Mallow house. The closer that we got, the colder it seemed to get, as if the place had its own climate. I could feel the dampness in the air now, the earthy smell from the neglected garden mixed with the scent of old wood. Our footsteps crunched softly, and the sound seemed to disappear into the thick silence surrounding the house. When we had reached the gate, we paused. The iron bars were rusty and the gate itself hung crooked on its hinges, like it hadn't been opened in years. But tonight it was ajar, just wide enough for us to slip through. Josh, ever the brave one, was the first to step inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken. I followed, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me. Ethan brought up the rear, looking back over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting something or someone to jump out from behind the bushes. The porch creaked under our weight as we climbed the steps. I could see the door now, a massive oak thing with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. It looked ancient, the kind of thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. The windows were dark, covered with heavy curtains that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from behind them. I reached out and grabbed the knocker. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the cold brass, before bringing it down with a loud thunk. The sound echoed through the house, hollow and unsettling. We waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the yard, but inside the house, there was only silence. Josh shot us a look trying to play it cool, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Well, I guess no one's home. Ethan turned to leave. Sorry guys, nope, peace out. But before we could leave, we heard it. The faint creak of floorboards like someone shifting their weight inside. We froze, another creak, closer this time, and then the soft click of the lock being turned. The door opened slowly inch by inch until it revealed a narrow gap. No light came from inside, just darkness so thick it felt like it would swallow us whole. And then a low, raspy voice. Come in. I glanced at Josh, expecting him to make some stupid joke and run, but his face had gone pale. Ethan took a step back, muttering under his breath. Hell no, man, no way. But before any of us could move, the door opened wider. Standing there in the doorway was Mr. Mallow. He looked even older than I expected, more skeletal. His skin was waxy, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes, you couldn't see them. They looked hollow, empty, shadows casted around them like two black holes. He didn't smile, didn't offer any kind of greeting, just stood there and stared at us. His clothes were dirty, stained in patches that I couldn't identify, and his hands were covered in something dark like oil. My stomach turned as I tried to make sense of it all. Trick or treat, Josh said weakly, his voice cracking. Mr. Mallow's gaze flicked down to Josh and then back to me and finally to Ethan. His lips twitched like he was trying to smile but had forgotten how. Slowly, he raised one hand, motioning for us to come inside. You boys are just in time. We've been waiting. I felt something cold run down my spine. We. Ethan stepped back again, his voice barely audible. Guys, let's go, now. But before we could move, something shifted in the shadows behind Mr. Mallow. I couldn't see it at first, just the movement, but it was something dark. And then slowly, as my eyes adjusted, I began to make it out. It was Mrs. Mallow, or what was left of her. We stood frozen at the door, eyes locked on the sight before us. Mrs. Mallow was hunched over at the kitchen table, barely illuminated by the dim light. At first glance, she looked almost normal. Just an old woman sitting down for a quiet meal, her thin hands resting limply on the table, as though she had been waiting for someone, waiting for us. But then I saw it. The way that her body sagged like something inside her was giving way, crumbling. Her head lolled to one side, neck bent at an impossible angle, and her body seemed to deflate, slumping lower as if gravity was pulling her apart, piece by piece. Her skin, pale and waxy under the faint light, clung loosely to her bones, too loose, sagging in folds as though her flesh was simply draped over a frame that was barely holding it together. She didn't move at first, just sat there, her empty eyes staring at us. But then there was this sound. It was low at first, a faint crinkling noise. Mrs. Mallow began to shift, slowly, horribly. Her legs seemed to twitch, her knees jerking unnaturally beneath the table as her whole body started to fold in on itself, collapsing in slow motion. Her back arched, her spine pushing out against her thin skin, the bones grinding and popping as if they were breaking apart, rearranging themselves in ways they weren't supposed to. She was twisting and contorting, her limbs bending into unnatural angles as her body crumpled lower and lower until she finally poured out of the chair, hitting the floor with a dull thud. For a second, she didn't move, just lay there in a heap, her limbs splayed out, her chest heaving in shallow, rasping breaths. And then slowly, horrifyingly, she began to crawl. Her hands slapped against the floor, too fast and too eager, like some twisted animal skittering across the ground. Her skin, that loose, sagging skin, dragged behind her as she moved, sticking to the floor in patches like it was melting off her bones. She crawled on all fours, her body twitching with each movement. But her head stayed locked on us, those empty, hollow eyes fixed on us, unwavering like she could see us even though there was nothing there behind them. Nothing but blackness. Her mouth hung open, jaw unhinged, but instead of words, a wet gurgling sound bubbled up from her throat, thick and coating, like she was trying to speak, but something inside of her was broken. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. My legs were locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body just wouldn't listen. She was getting closer too fast, her hands slapping against the floor, her joints popping and grinding with every jerking movement. And her face, God, her face. It was rotting, decaying, skin peeling away from her cheeks in thick, wet strips, revealing the gray flesh beneath. The stench hit us then, thick and rancid, the unmistakable smell of something long dead, something that had been festering in the dark for far too long. Josh let out a strangled gasp, his voice barely a whisper, and he grabbed at my sleeve. "Run," he said, his words trembling. "Now." But I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She was almost at the door now, her gnarled fingers reaching out toward us, clawing at the air and reaching out for us. Suddenly, her body convulsed, her back arching violently as her whole frame shuddered, and then she collapsed again, her head hitting the floor with a sickening crack, but she didn't stop. She kept coming, crawling, scraping, inching closer and closer. Josh was the first to break. He shoved past us, bolting down the steps and back toward the street. Ethan and I were right behind him, not looking back, just running as fast as we could. I could hear the door creak shut behind us, but no footsteps followed, just that horrible silence. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the block, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. I glanced back at the Mallow house, half expecting to see them standing there watching us, or worse, chasing us. But the porch was empty and the door was closed. We didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there gulping down cold air, staring back at the Mallow house, expecting something. But nothing happened. The place was dark and silent again, like it had always been. I could still see the faint glimmer of that dim porch light, but otherwise it was just another shadow on the street. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "What the hell was that? Did you see that? What was that?" Josh didn't answer. He was bent over, hands on his knees, still catching his breath. But I could see it in his face that he saw it too. He was more freaked out than I had ever seen him. That cocky grin that he always had was gone, replaced by the look of a scared child. I swallowed, my mouth dry. My brain was still trying to catch up with what I had seen. That thing, that couldn't have been her. Not really, no one's body was supposed to look like that. The way that she moved, the way she looked, the image was burned into my mind, and I felt vomit forming in my throat. Josh straightened up, finally breaking the silence. "And that wasn't normal," he said, his voice flat. "There's no way that was normal." "What do we do?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide, darting between Josh and me. "We just can't leave it like this. What if somebody else goes there tonight? That wasn't just some crazy old people, that was." Josh cut him off, his voice hard. "We're not doing anything. We're going home and forgetting this ever happened." "Are you serious?" I blurted out. "We can't just pretend that we didn't see that. What if something's really wrong in there? What if they need our help?" Josh whipped around, glaring at me. "Did they look like they wanted to help you? That was messed up, man. I'm not going back there, and you shouldn't either. It's not our problem." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in Josh's eyes shut me up. He wasn't being a tough guy anymore. He was scared, really scared. And maybe he was right. What could we even do? Call the cops and tell them what? Ethan was biting his lip, his hand shaking. "Man, I just want to go home. Let's go." We started walking fast at first, like we could outrun the memory of that house, of Mrs. Mallow's twisted body. But it stuck with me, clinging to the back of my mind like a nightmare that I couldn't shake. By the time that we made it to Josh's place, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving us exhausted and rattled. We didn't even bother to check the rest of our candy haul. The excitement of the night had soured, curdled into something darker, something that we didn't want to talk about. And Josh's parents were still in the living room when we had barged in, laughing with their friends, oblivious to what had happened. For a second, the normalcy of it all made me feel unhinged, like maybe we had imagined the whole thing, but I knew that we hadn't. I could still see the way that Mrs. Mallow's body moved, like a puppet with tangled strings. "I'm going to bed," Josh muttered, not even bothering to say goodnight. Ethan and I mumbled something in return, but nobody was in the mood for conversation. We were all too busy replaying what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. Ethan and I headed upstairs to Josh's room, but neither of us bothered to change into pajamas or unpack our bags. We just laid there staring at the ceiling. Every creak in the house and every groan in the floorboards made my heart jump. I kept picturing Mrs. Mallow's face. No, not her face, but her mask. That's what it looked like. A mask stretched too tight over something rotten underneath. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watching us, not just looking at us, but really seeing us, like she had marked us somehow. It was a dumb thought, but it stuck with me all night. I was terrified that I would wake up and she would be standing over me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were a mess of dark hallways, twisted bodies, and eyes. Those empty, hollow eyes staring at me. When I woke up the next morning, my skin was slick with cold sweat and my heart was still pounding. We didn't talk about the Mallow house the next day. Not really. Josh was quiet and distant, which wasn't like him. He usually couldn't stop running his mouth, but now he just mumbled answers and kept his eyes down and didn't crack a single joke. Ethan left early, muttering something about having to help his dad with some yard work, but I knew that he just wanted to be out of there. I didn't blame him. The whole thing felt like we had stumbled into something that humans weren't supposed to see. I left soon after, walking back to my house in the cold autumn sunlight, but the daylight didn't help. The world felt quieter and heavier. I couldn't get rid of that feeling sitting in my chest, like something bad was coming for me. That night, I kept thinking about what Mr. Mallow had said. We've been waiting. Waiting for what? Why had they opened the door for us? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave me. Every shadow seemed a little too dark, every creak of the house a little too loud. I didn't sleep well for days. And then about a week later, I heard the news. Mr. and Mrs. Mallow were dead. It wasn't until the smell had started leaking out of the house that the neighbors called somebody to check on them. They found Mr. Mallow dead in his recliner. He had been dead for weeks. But for Mrs. Mallow, they found her body upstairs in a chair rotting. The coroner said that she must have been dead for at least a year. Mr. Mallow had never told anyone. But I saw her, I saw both of them, we all did. That night, I swear that we saw her moving, walking, and staring at us with those dead eyes. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't explain what we saw. Josh wouldn't talk about it, and neither would Ethan. We all just went back to our lives pretending that it didn't happen, but it stayed with us, lingering in the back of our minds, a memory that we didn't want but couldn't shake. The town boarded up the house and left it to rot. Nobody wanted to buy it. No one even wanted to get close enough to tear it down. But every year near Halloween, when the air turns cold and the leaves start to fall, I think about that night. About what we saw, about what really happened in that house. That sound, that wet crunch of her body as it hit the floor. It's burned into my memory. I swear that I can still hear it sometimes, like an echo in the back of my mind. I had been right. That was, in fact, the last year I ever went trick-or-treating. I was working the closing shift at Footworks, the shoe store crammed into the far corner of the Chapel Hills Mall. Halloween was supposed to be a night of fun, but instead, I was stuck stocking sneakers for minimum wage. I only had a half hour left in my shift, and I could feel the seconds crawling by. The clock on my phone felt frozen at 7:30 p.m. I drummed my fingers on the counter trying to stay awake. My manager, who was supposed to help me close, had tucked out for an early smoke break and never came back. Most of the customers had already thinned out, but there were still a few stragglers wandering around the mall. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my friend Ben. "Yo, you coming tonight or what?" I sighed. I had been dodging the question all day. Ben's Halloween party was supposed to be the big event of the night. Half of the school was going, including all of my friends, but I hadn't planned on going. After my shift was over, all I really wanted to do was crash in my bed. I started typing. Probably not, when another text popped up. Don't be lame, man, it's Halloween." I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the keyboard. It had been a while since I had done anything fun, and even though I didn't have a costume, I could always grab something cheap from the Halloween store on my way. I wasn't exactly Mr. Social, but maybe it wouldn't hurt to get out of the house for once. "Yo," a voice called from the store entrance, breaking my introspection. I looked up and saw Ben and Derek walking into the store like they owned the place. Ben flashed a grin, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Come on, bro, you're not getting out of this one, you're coming tonight," Ben said, leaning against the counter. Derek nodded, smirking. "Yeah, man, you never come to anything. You didn't show up last year either." "Look," I started. "I'm just tired and I don't even have a costume and I don't even have time to." "You've got time," Ben interrupted. "The party doesn't start until 10. Grab something cheap and just show up. It's not like you have anything better to do." I sighed. They weren't wrong. As much as I wanted to protest, I started to give in to the pressure. Ben raised an eyebrow, a smirk growing on his face, anticipating my answer. "Fine," I muttered. "I'll come, but I probably won't stay for long." "Yes, there it is." Ben grinned, patting me on the shoulder. "You're gonna have a good time, bud, trust me." Derek glanced at his watch. "All right, well, we're heading out. We'll see you there." I watched them leave the store, their laughter fading as they disappeared out of the mall. I wasn't sure that I believed Ben about having a good time, but I was locked in now. I just had to make it through the last stretch of my shift, to grab a costume and then down a few drinks to make the night more tolerable. The mall was basically empty now. Most of the other stores were now closed, and the place began to get a little darker as more and more lights were turned off. I started mentally checking off the closing tasks, sweep the floor, cash out the register, routine stuff. As I was counting the minutes to clock out, something caught my eye near the entrance. A person stood there just outside the store facing me. They were in a Halloween costume, a creepy red latex devil mask which had a large pointy nose and a cartoonish wide smile which reached ear to ear. Small black horns protruded from the top of the mask. It looked pretty realistic, like one of those expensive movie quality masks. Had it not been so startling, it would have actually been pretty impressive. The mask was paired with a mismatched black and red suit that looks like it was put together from pieces found at a thrift store. At first, I assumed it was a last-minute shopper or someone probably killing time before heading to a party. But they stood completely still facing me, not moving. Not browsing, not shopping, just standing there. I felt my chest tighten up. There was no reason to be freaked out by some weirdo in a Halloween costume. But something about them made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The way that they were just standing still watching me began to eat away at my nerves. I was about to tell him that we're closed when he turned slowly and deliberately and walked away. I just stared, frozen in place. His steps were slow and measured, almost robotic as he disappeared out of sight. I exhaled, realizing that I'd been holding my breath the entire time. What the hell was that all about, I thought. Just some creep messing around probably. It was Halloween after all. I shook it off, trying to refocus on closing the store and getting out of there. But every few seconds I found myself glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see that creepy guy in a devil mask there again watching me. By the time that I finally clocked out, I was beat and my nerves were shot. I made my way out of the now empty mall toward my car, checking behind my shoulder every few seconds. I safely made it to my car, now fully convinced that the person or whoever it was simply messing around with me. I brushed off that feeling and headed to the Halloween store to pick up a costume for the party. The Halloween store was one of those pop-up stores that showed up every year, taking over abandoned sporting goods stores and the like. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, a chime sounding, ringing loudly in the nearly empty store. The place was a mess. Shelves were mostly empty now and decorations were scattered all over the floor, with a few straggling shoppers picking over the scraps. The sound of Halloween music played faintly through the speakers. I wandered aimlessly, searching for any scraps of a costume. The aisles were nearly bare, but I kept looking, feeling the pressure of time build. Suddenly the music cut off, leaving the store in an uncomfortable silence. I knew that I didn't have much time before they closed, and so I hurried, eyes darting over the shelves. The door chimed again, as somebody else had come in, but I didn't bother to look. I was too focused. At the end of one aisle, I found a small rack with cheap knockoff masks of famous movie killers. I grabbed a plastic Jason-style mask and headed for the register, rushing to get out. As I turned the corner, my heart lurched. There he was, the man in the devil mask. He stood at the far end of the aisle, illuminated by the dim flickering light. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. My stomach twisted and my throat went dry. No way, I thought, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. He stood perfectly still, just staring. For a split second, I considered throwing the mask down and bolting, but something kept me rooted. Maybe it was disbelief, maybe shock. I told myself it was a coincidence, forcing my legs to carry me to the front. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as I approached, too busy scrolling through his phone. My skin crawled as I sensed the man in the devil mask moving closer. His eyes locked on me. I could feel it, the weight of his stare boring into me. "Just this," I muttered, tossing the cheap mask onto the counter. It felt so pointless, but at least I wouldn't show up to Ben's party without something. The cashier rang it up slowly, the beeps of the register cutting through the heavy silence. I kept my head down, resisting the urge to look back, but I knew he was still there watching me. "That'll be $10.53, the cashier said, snapping his gum, finally glancing up at me. I handed him the crumpled bills, my hand shaking slightly as I grabbed the change and shoved the mask into a bag. Without another word, I made a quick escape toward the exit. The bell chimed again as I pushed through the door and the cold night air hit me like a splash of water. I exhaled sharply, tension easing from my shoulders. Instinctively, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him, the man in the devil mask, standing at the entrance, following me still. But there was nothing. Just the empty store and a couple of people loitering on the sidewalk. He was gone again. I shook my head and got in my car. I kept reminding myself it's Halloween and creepiness was just a part of it. And besides, I had bigger things to worry about, like not making myself look like an idiot at Ben's party. By the time that I made it to Ben's place, the party was already in full swing. Cars were parked up and down the block, and I could hear the bass from the music thumping before I even stepped out of my car. The house was decorated to the nines, fake cobwebs hanging from the trees, jack-o'-lanterns lining the walkway, and orange lights flickering in the windows. I could hear Rob Zombie's Dracula blasting from inside the house. I pulled the plastic hockey mask out of the bag and slipped it over my face. It wasn't much, but it would do. I didn't feel like going all out for this party anyway. I just wanted to blend in, have a few drinks, and hopefully avoid any awkward moments with people. The front door was wide open and people were spilling out into the yard, already tipsy and laughing too loud. I stepped inside and the smell of beer and sweat hitting me immediately. Ben's living room was packed, people in costumes, some elaborate and some as half-assed as mine, dancing, drinking, and yelling over the blaring music. "Hey, you actually came." Ben appeared out of nowhere, clapping me on the back hard enough to nearly knock me over. He was wearing a vampire costume, complete with fake blood dripping from his mouth. "Yeah, well, you didn't really give me a choice," I said jokingly, raising my voice to be heard over the music. "Here, grab a drink," Ben shouted, shoving a plastic cup of beer into my hand before I could protest. "We're playing beer pong in the kitchen, come on." I hesitated. Beer pong wasn't really my thing, but it was better than standing around awkwardly in the corner. "Sure, yeah, why not?" I followed him into the kitchen where a crowd had gathered around a table lined with orange plastic cups. Somebody had set up a fog machine and the room was filled with swirling white mist, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I took a swig of beer and tried to relax. It was a party after all. We played several games. The beer had begun to do its job with loosening me up a little bit, and I was actually starting to have fun. For a moment, I even began to question myself on why I didn't go out more. But just as that thought had occurred, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The figure, that devil mask, that long pointy nose and wide smile. He was standing in the living room just beyond the edge of the crowd, perfectly still like he had been at the store. He didn't move or try to talk to anyone, he just stood there watching me. My throat went dry and my stomach twisted into knots. What the hell was he doing here? How did he follow me here? I blinked, half expecting him to disappear like a trick of the light. But when I looked again, he was still there. He raised his hand and gave me a slow, taunting wave, and he turned to leave. Maybe it was the drinks or maybe it was the feeling of security from the crowd, but anger began to boil up inside of me. I set my drink down and pushed through the crowd trying to keep him in sight. I wanted to grab him and find out who he was and why the hell he was following me. But by the time that I had reached the living room, he was gone. Just like that. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. People were laughing, talking, and dancing like nothing was wrong. I thought about telling Ben, but what could I say? That some weirdo in a devil mask had been following me around all night. He would just think that I was paranoid. I needed to calm down. I told myself it was just some guy playing a prank, maybe somebody who had been at the mall earlier and recognized me. Or maybe it was somebody that I knew just messing with me. It was Halloween and people were supposed to be creepy. I grabbed another beer, took a long drink, and forced myself to chill out. It was all in my head, it's nothing to worry about. I didn't stay at the party long after that. After a couple of more beers and some awkward small talk, I made my excuses and I slipped out. I just wasn't in the mood anymore. All I could think about was that guy. Every time I turned around, I expected to see him in his devil mask, standing there and watching me. It was a relief to get back to my car and leave the noise and chaos of the party behind. The streets were quiet as I drove home, the occasional group of teenagers in costumes still wandering the sidewalks. My parents' house was only a few blocks away, and when I pulled into the driveway, everything seemed peaceful. The porch light was on and the pumpkins were lit on the front porch. I parked and walked up the front steps, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door. The quiet was almost comforting after the noise of the party. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. They had probably gone to bed already. I flipped on the hallway light and headed for the stairs, planning to just crash in my room and forget about the whole night. But something stopped me. A sound. A drip, a slow, steady drip. Not the drip of a sink, but a heavier, thicker drip. Slowly, I made my way toward the sound in the direction of the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes scanned around the house. As I got closer to the kitchen, the sound got louder, and there was something else. A smell, an odd smell, almost like copper, thick in the air. I rounded the corner into the kitchen when I saw the outline of something. Not something, someone. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was my dad. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and so was my mom. Only something was wrong. They were sitting at the table side by side like they had been waiting for me, but there was something horribly wrong. So wrong that it took my brain a moment to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Their heads, they were gone. The jagged red stumps of their necks were all that remained, blood streaking down their clothes, pooling onto the floor. The table, once warm and familiar, was now soaked in it. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stood frozen in shock, every muscle locked in place as my brain struggled to process the nightmare in front of me. At first, I wasn't able to comprehend if what I was seeing was real or some twisted hallucination. And then I saw him. The man, the devil, standing in the corner, almost blending into the shadows. He was big, much bigger up close, and his posture was unnervingly calm. In each hand, he held a head, their heads by the hair, the thick strands twisted around his fingers. In his hands, I saw the source of the sound. Blood dripped from their severed heads, landing on the tile floor with a soft and rhythmic clipping. The sound was horrible, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of the dripping in my own heartbeat. He didn't move, he didn't flinch. He just stood there perfectly still. His arms were reached up toward me, holding my parents' heads proudly like two trophies. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in fear. I slowly backed away, step by step, my eyes never leaving him. His head didn't turn, his body didn't shift. He just stared with that pointy nose, that huge red smile, as if he were frozen in time. I kept moving backward, my chest tightening with every inch that I gained. The last thing that I saw before I turned and ran was the man still standing there in the corner, heads dangling from his head, utterly motionless, his cold eyes boring into me. He never moved, and somehow that was worse. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers barely worked as I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator what had happened. When the police came and arrived, the house was empty. The man, the devil, was gone. They never found him. The police chalked it up to some kind of gruesome home invasion, but I knew the truth. He had been following me the whole night, maybe longer, watching and waiting for the perfect moment. He had wanted me to see, to know. He chose me for some reason. That was last Halloween when my life was forever changed. I'm terrified he's going to come back for me this Halloween. I'm terrified that at any moment I'm going to see that mask again.